Hi everyone. In this video we will be discussing about event listeners. So we discussed about delegation event model in one of our previous video, and we know that a delegation event model consists of event source and event listener, and we have also seen what or how we can implement event source in Java. Event sources are implemented as classes in Java programming. And in this lecture we will be discussing about how to implement event listeners. We also know that only those listeners that are registered with a source gets the notification about the event. So we have to register the listener with a source, then only the source will delegate the event informations to this listener. So how these listeners are implemented in Java programming? Listeners are actually created by implementing certain number of interfaces. So we can implement one or more interfaces. So listeners are actually implemented or created by using these interfaces. So whenever an event occurs in a source, the source will call the appropriate method inside that listener. So that call takes place automatically. We don't have to write specifically, or we don't have to call specifically a method inside interface. Only thing we have to do is we have to implement the corresponding listener. We have to register the listener with the source. Then when an event occurs inside that source, the source will call the appropriate method inside this interface. It will be more clear when we discuss an example about this. So for the time being, just understand that the listeners are implemented by using interface. So when and how to use an interface in a Java program, we have to use the keyword implements. So for example, class A implements interface 1, interface 2, interface 3. A class can implement any number of interfaces at a time. That's the most important advantage of interface. An interface is actually a concept that was introduced to overcome the drawback of or lack of multiple inheritance in Java. So a class can inherit or implement more than one interface. So when one class implements one interface, or when a class, in this case here it is a source, so when one event occurs inside the source, the corresponding method inside. So like we have seen a list of event sources or event classes in Java, we have a list of event listeners also. So you can see how many methods are there inside each interface. In ActionListener Interface we have only one method. In AdjustmentListener Interface also we have only one method. In component listeners we have 4 methods. Likewise we have each interface and the number of methods inside that interface. And we know that what the definition of interface is. Interface is actually a collection of abstract methods. It will not contain the body of methods. It will contain only headers of or the method signatures. The body we have to write. So suppose I am implementing this action listener. Inside this action listener I have one method. So in my class I have to write the body of that method. That is how we have to do this. So all these names were there in the event classes also. We had action event, we had adjustment event, we had component event, we had item event, we had key event, mouse event. So all these names were there in the event class also. So that means we can see here the relation between them. All the action events will will be dealt with, or will be dealt by this action listener interface. All the adjustment events will be dealt by this adjustment listener interface. All the mouse events will be listened or will be dealt by this mouse listener. So corresponding to each event class we have got a corresponding listener interface also. So if you know the class names or the event source names, to get the corresponding listener interface name is very easy. Suppose the class name is action event, then the corresponding listener interface name will be action listener. So I hope you got the relation between the action event names and the event source names and the listener interface names. So we'll see some of the listener interfaces. So first listener interface is ActionListener Interface. So we know how to name an interface. The name of the interface must be similar, must be written the same by using the same rules as that of the class names. The first letter must be capital. If the name consists of more than one word, there should not be any space between them. The first and if the name consists of more than one word, then the first letter of all words must be capital. Okay. So this listener interface consists of one method, and that method name is action performed. So this method is actually built-in method. It's not a method written by us. So this method name must be the same. This is the method name that we have to use. See how it is written. It consists of two words, does not have a space in between. The first word is completely in small letters, and second word starts with a capital letter. So this is known as camel case letters. That is a naming convention followed by Java. This is how Java names methods in the programs. So this is the name. This is a rule that Java follows. So whenever an action event occurs, okay, whenever an action event occurs, if this listener interface is, or if this listener interface is implemented, that is, if in our program, if our class have implemented this interface, then if we have registered this listener, then if an action event occurs, then this method will be invoked automatically. So what we have to do is we have to implement this interface. If we are planning to handle an action event, what we have to do is we have to implement this interface in our class. Then we have to register the component. Suppose we are planning to handle an event, action event that takes place on a button. So we have to register the action listener to that button, because button is the source of the event. So with that source we have to register the listener. So in the current example I am talking about, button is the source, so I have to register the action listener to that button. So whenever the button is clicked, an action event will be generated. Then this method, action performed method, inside this interface will be called automatically. So what we have to do is we have to write the lines of code inside this method. That is, what should happen when we click on that button. All that things must be written inside this method. So naturally when we click on that button, the control will be forwarded to this method, and all the lines of code that we write inside that method will get executed. This is the same way we have to do with other interface also. Again, the next interface is ActionListener Interface. So suppose we are planning to use or handle adjustment events. Handle the adjustment event. You know that in adjustment we have seen the adjustment event class. So if you are planning to handle adjustment events, we have to first of all implement this interface. We have to register the source to this. We have to register this listener to the source on which we are planning to handle. Suppose we are planning to handle on a scroll bar. We have to register this listener to that scroll bar, because scroll bar is the source where this event will be generated. So whenever an adjustment event occurs, okay, this method will be called automatically. And see here, the method name consists of three names: adjustment, value, changed. And see how it is written. There are no space between the words. The first word is completely in small letters. Starting from the second word, the first letter is capital. Here V is capital and C is also capital. This is known as camel case letters. This is the naming convention followed by Java. So whenever an adjustment event occurs, if this listener is registered, then the corresponding source will send the event information to this method automatically. Next we have ComponentListener Interface. So component means a text box is a component, a frame is a component, a button is a component. All these are components. So in this listener interface we have four methods, and four methods are related to resize, move, show, or hide. So if you are moving a component, then if that source, suppose I'm planning to handle the component events, so what I have to do is, in my class I have to implement this interface, then I have to register this listener with the source. Suppose I am planning to handle the component events on a button, so I have to register this interface with that button. So when that button is moved, since I have registered this listener, the button will generate one event named resized, and it will call the method component resized inside this listener interface. If a button is uh, hidden, or if we are trying to hide a button, already visible button, if you are trying to hide it, then component hidden method will be invoked automatically. So once the interface, or once the listener is registered with the source, all the when the corresponding events occurs, the corresponding method inside the interface will be invoked automatically. So in component listener interface we have 4 methods. That means they are handling 4 different events. When the component is resized, it will be calling component resized method. When the component is moved, the component will send the event information and to this method component moved. When a hidden component is shown again, then the source, suppose in our example, if it is button, the button will send the corresponding information and call the method component shown. If already visible component is made hidden, then the corresponding source will send all the event information to the method component hidden. Next we have KeyListener Interface. Suppose we want to deal with the events that takes place in a keyboard, then we have to use this listener interface. So if you have to deal with the events on a keyboard, what we have to do is, first of all we have to implement this interface, the first thing. Second thing is, we have to register this listener with our keyboard or our program. So whenever a key is pressed, then one event occurs, then it will, that event, then our source will automatically call this key pressed event or key pressed method inside the listener interface. Whenever a key is released, it will generate all the required event information and it will pass and it will call the method key released inside this listener interface. So generally, if a source have to call a particular method inside a listener interface, we have to register the source with that listener. That is the most important thing in delegation event model, because only the registered listeners will get the notifications of the corresponding events. If I have not registered the key listener interface with my program, then none of the key events will get handled, or we will not be able to handle the key events, because the key listener interface is not registered with the source. So if you want to handle an event, the first thing we have to do is register the interface, register the listener with our program, implement the listener, then automatically when an event occurs, the corresponding method will be invoked. Then MouseListener Interface, it have got 6 methods. So whenever mouse is clicked, this method will be invoked. Whenever mouse enters the boundary of a component, this method will be invoked. When mouse moves away from a component, this method will be invoked. When mouse is pressed, that is whenever we press the mouse button, this method will be invoked. And when we release the mouse button, press the mouse button, this method will be invoked. So hope you know the difference between click and press. Mouse clicked means we pressed and released the mouse button, that is known as a click. So if we have registered mouse listener with our source, for example, I have a label or a text box in my program. If I am registering this MouseListener interface with that text box, then if I click inside the text box, then mouse clicked method will be invoked by that text box. Why I'm saying that the text box will call? Because I have registered this MouseListener interface with that text box. So in this example, text box is the source. So whenever since I have registered MouseListener interface with, or MouseListener with the text box, okay, whenever a mouse related event occurs inside the text box, the source is here, the source is text box, it will generate the event and it will call the corresponding method inside the corresponding interface. So in this case it is MouseListener interface, it will call the method mouse clicked. So these are some of the explanations of listener interfaces. So in Java, listener is implemented by means of interface. Interfaces are actually collection of abstract methods. Abstract methods means interfaces will contain only method headers. We have to write the lines of code inside the method header. We have to implement the method inside the class in which we are implementing the interface. So in the next video lecture we will see an example how this listener interface or how this event delegation event model work. I hope it's clear about event class and event listeners by now. We'll see one example in the next video lecture. Thank you.